Hola! In this video, we're going to take a look at something called reflexive verbs, or los verbos reflexivos. So what exactly are reflexive verbs? Well, we can tell that first by knowing that it's a verb, it's an action. And in this case, it's an action where the subject both does and receives the action. I like to think of these as like boomerang verbs. When you throw a boomerang, it goes out far, and then it comes back to you, the person that threw it. Same thing is kind of happening here. It's the same idea. You're doing the action, and it's coming back to you. Or someone else is doing the action, and it's going back to them. Regardless, it's the person that is doing the action and receiving the action. And that's what makes it reflexive. The action reflects on itself. Now, these types of verbs do exist in English as well. We just don't often seem to think of them as being done to ourselves. Right? But if we think of it this way, I wash my hands. I'm doing the action, and I'm receiving the action of washing myself in this case. He looks at himself in the mirror a lot. He's looking and doing it to himself. She brushes her teeth. She's doing the brushing and done to her teeth. And they dress themselves. But there are some things that are not reflexive as well, and maybe that's what we're more familiar with so far. For example, I wash the car. I'm doing the action, but not to myself. I'm doing the action to the car. He looks at the picture, same thing. She brushes her daughter's hair. Notice it's not brushing herself in any way, it's done to somebody else. And maybe you know somebody that does this, they dress their dog in stupid sweaters. We've all seen that, especially around Christmas time. Not reflexive, though, because it's not done to themselves, but to someone or something else. So let's look at a list of some common reflexive verbs. Now, you already have this list, and you should have it fully completed. I just want to take a look at a few of these specifically, and we can kind of understand what they're meaning to say as far as the reflexive goes. Let's look at the first one, afeitarse. Afeitarse means to shave oneself. That's literally to do the action to yourself, or someone's doing the action to themselves. Where we get the oneself is in the ending here with the se. That's something maybe you haven't seen yet so far. But we're going to add that in now to show that the action is done to oneself. And we'll look at that se here in just a little bit more. But notice, the action changes just a little bit. Instead of just to shave, we have to add the idea of oneself. If we look at the verb vestirse, to get dressed, or literally to dress oneself. Secarse, to dry off, or to dry oneself. And finally, quitarse. Quitarse means to take off. Think of an item of clothing, but you're taking it off of yourself. So when thinking about these actions, try not to think too literally, but be thinking of the action that's being done and whether or not you're doing it to yourself. It's a tricky concept at first. Memorize this list of verbs and it will help you. But eventually you'll get the idea of the action being done to a person or not, and that'll help you remember if it should be reflexive or not. So, as you probably guessed, and you probably already know by now, there's a chart that goes with this as well. There seems to be a chart for everything. But these charts are helpful, and they help us kind of compare ideas, especially across languages between Spanish and English. What this chart does is it shows us the reflexive object pronouns. What those basically tell us is who is receiving the action, or who the action is being done to. And we'll look at the conjugations of the verbs here in just a second, but these basically just show us who is receiving the action. So we have me, and the English equivalent would be myself. So if I'm doing the action to myself. Te, yourself. This would be if you are doing the action to yourself. Se could either refer to himself, herself, or one's self. And we want to be able to clarify so we know who we're talking about, since that could be either himself, herself, or oneself, that we make sure we include our pronouns that we're familiar with, like él and ella, before our verb. We'll get into that here in just a moment. We have nos. Nos refers to ourselves, so if we are doing something to ourselves. And finally, se, which would be themselves or each other. You want to memorize this chart and the English equivalents, And when you're thinking about do I use the reflexive or not? Do I use these pronouns or not? You want to be thinking, is the action done to myself or yourself or him or herself, etc. And then you'll attach one of these pronouns. So since we're not familiar with how to attach these pronouns, let's take a look at that next. So let's take a look at how to conjugate reflexive verbs. If you take a look at the screen here, it gives you the English way to conjugate and then an example in Spanish. And we're going to take a look at this example with lavarse, to wash oneself. So literally the action is being done to a person here, and that person is doing it to themselves. And let's set our goal here of being able to say, I wash my hands. So we really have about a 4-step process here. And when you get better at this, you can move ahead quicker and kind of skip some of the steps because you know how to do it. But let's look at first how to conjugate these reflexive verbs with our 4-step process. Step number 1, move the pronoun to the front. So we're going to take the se off at the end and move it to the front. Step number 2, change the pronoun for who receives the action. Think about that chart we just looked at, and you'll add that to add one of those pronouns at the beginning, and you'll change it to show who's doing the action, whether it's myself, yourself, himself, herself, etc. And then the rest is just like conjugating a normal verb that you're familiar with how to do already. Step number 3, take off the AR, the ER, or the IR. And then finally, we're going to add the verb ending for who does the action. The verb ending, of course, would be for an AR verb, o, as, a, amos, an. For an ER verb, o, es, e, emos, en. And for an IR verb, o, es, e, imos, en. So again, we have this goal of saying, I wash my hands. Let's take a look at now how this step process would work. So again, we have the verb lavarse. We want to say, I wash my hands. Here's our verb lavarse. And then we want to make this little change here to show that I am doing the action to myself. So, step number 1, move the pronoun to the front. So we have lavarse, we move it to the front. We take the se, and now it is in front of lavar. Step 2, change the pronoun for who receives the action. I am washing myself, so I would use the me. So notice the se now changes to me. Step number 3, take off the AR, ER, IR. In this case, lavar se is an AR verb, so we take off the AR. Now we're left with me lav. Now all we simply have to do is add the ending for a normal AR verb in the yo form, which is step number 4. And we know that since I'm doing the action, we add the o in the yo form, me lavo. Now finally, to complete our goal of saying I wash my hands, we simply add hands to our ending, and we have me lavo las manos. I wash my hands. Or literally, if you want to think of it this way, I wash my hands myself. Let's look at a few simple examples here, and I want to highlight a few things as far as the conjugations go. Let's look at number 1 in the yo form again. I shower myself. So we would basically do that 4-step process, right? With the me in front. We know we're talking about ourselves, so we conjugate it in the yo form. And we have me ducho por la noche. I shower myself at night. Do you brush your hair? So the person is doing it to themselves. In this case, you're asking somebody saying, do you do this to yourself? So we use the te because it's yourself, and the as ending because it's an AR verb. Te cepillas tu pelo? And you all know there should be a upside down exclamation point here. Next, Maria goes to bed at 10 p.m. We're going to use the verb acostarse to go to bed. Maria se, because she's doing it to herself, acuesta a las 10 de la noche. We always brush our teeth. Again, the action of brushing teeth is done to ourselves. We're in the nosotros form. We have nosotros nos cepillamos los dientes siempre. Now some of you might be thinking, well, I already said nosotros, why do I need the nos? Well, nosotros just means we, but the nos says that we're doing it to ourselves, so make sure to include that nos as well. And then finally, they dry themselves off after swimming. We're in the they form, the ellos. So ellos se secan. They do it to themselves, and we're talking about them. I want you to try some practice on your own here. So this is the point where you're going to pause the video, Take a couple of minutes, write down these 8 examples, and see if you can come up with what they would look like in Spanish. Keep in mind, the action is being done to somebody, someone is receiving their own action. We want to make sure we use the reflexive verbs and the reflexive object pronouns. Feel free to use your chart. If you need to look up the charts for the conjugation of the verbs, that's fine as well. And be careful, some of these verbs have stem changes, and those are noted on your verb list. So at this point, I'll stop talking. Thank goodness, right? And you can get to work. Write these down. Please pause the video. The answers will be on the next slide. So here we have our respuestas, our answers to some of those sentences and what they would look like in Spanish. I have underlined any verb that has a stem change in it, and you want to make sure that you have those stem changes down, and please note them yourselves. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to see me or leave a comment, and I'll get back to you. But keep in mind, reflexive verbs, when an person that does the action is receiving that same action, we call that reflexive. Make sure you use those reflexive object pronouns, and then just simply conjugate your verb like a normal verb. Suerte. Adios.